A wildfire had ripped through the valley, brutal and unforgiving. Smoke still clung to the trees like a warning whispered in ash. And there, in the silence and soot, a wild Mustang stood watch over a lynx cub on the edge of death. A prey animal, guarding a predator. Why didn't she run? And what happened next, not even nature could explain. The fire had finally stopped breathing. After 11 straight days of roaring flame and choking wind, the hills of British Columbia had fallen into an eerie, unnatural silence. What was once dense forest, teeming with elk herds, black bears, and untamed horses, had been reduced to a wasteland of smoke-stained bone and scorched tree stumps. Everything smelled like memory. Burnt. Faded. Gone. Riley Morgan adjusted the straps on his pack, stepping carefully over the blackened remains of a fallen pine. The ash here was ankle-deep, clinging to his boots like regret. He paused to catch his breath. Not from exhaustion, but reverence. He'd covered war zones, hurricanes, oil spills, but nothing compared to the aftermath of wildfire. This wasn't destruction. This was erasure. He was 47, wiry, sunburnt, and tired in a way only people who had seen too much solitude could be. A former Army medic turned wildlife documentarian, Riley had spent the last 2 decades chasing stories most people didn't believe until they saw the photos. He didn't do awards. He didn't do press. He did the things that didn't make the news. That morning, a ranger had called in a broken voice. The horses, some of them didn't make it out. We think a band got trapped in the Northeast Gorge. If you're looking for beauty shots, don't bother. He wasn't. He never was. By mid-morning, the sky had turned a strange, filtered gray, neither overcast nor clear. Just stained. The sunlight bent through the lingering smoke like it was ashamed to be there. Riley moved slow. Controlled. Every step was a guess. The land beneath him felt brittle, hollow. A place still holding its breath. He passed what looked like the remains of a deer, nothing but ribs and hooves, melted into the ground like candle wax. Birds hadn't returned yet. Not even scavengers. Then he saw the hoof print. One. Deep. Fresh. Not more than a few hours old. Riley crouched instinctively, brushing the ash aside. He followed the trail, carefully, heart ticking louder with each step. And then, through the skeletal remains of a cedar grove, he saw her. A Mustang. Wild. Untagged. Alone. Her coat, once a rich copper red, was dulled with ash and soot, streaked black down the flanks. Her mane had been scorched on one side, singed short, like half of her had walked through fire and the other half hadn't made it out. She was thin, breathing slow. But not injured. And she wasn't moving. She was standing in the center of a clearing where fire had clearly raged, charred trees stood like broken spears around her. Her ears twitched. Her tail flicked once. But her eyes were locked downward. At something. Riley raised his camera, adjusting the lens. And then he saw it. At the base of the Mustang's front hooves, nestled into a small cradle of ash and scorched moss, was a lynx cub. No bigger than a loaf of bread. Fur singed around the face and legs. One eye half closed. Ribs visible beneath patchy gray spots. It wasn't crying. Just shaking. Silent. Alone. There was no mother in sight. No prints leading in or out. No den. Riley blinked. Hard. What in God's name? He lowered the camera for a moment. Tried to process it. But there was no explaining this. A prey animal. Guarding a predator. Not attacking. Not fleeing. Just standing over it. Like a sentinel. The Mustang didn't flinch as he moved closer. She didn't lift her head or pin her ears. She barely looked at him. Her entire focus was on that Lynx Cub. And in that moment, Riley knew. This wasn't chance. This wasn't instinct. This was something else. Something no one had ever seen before. Something no one would believe unless he captured it. He raised his camera, clicked the shutter, and history began recording itself. At first, Ember took a step back. It was subtle, barely a shift in her weight. But to Riley, watching through the long lens of his telephoto, it was everything. Her ears pinned slightly. Her body tightened. That unmistakable moment of calculation every prey animal makes when confronted with something unfamiliar. She glanced toward the burned ridge behind her. One step and she could vanish into it. And for a second, she did. Her hooves turned, ash kicked up, and she pivoted away from the cub. But then, a sound. Not loud. Not sharp. Just the faintest whimper. A breath caught on pain. A noise too weak to beg. And Ember stopped. She didn't bolt. Didn't run. She stood still, like a statue painted in soot. Then slowly, cautiously, she turned back. Riley held his breath. Through the lens, he could see her nostrils flare, not wide with fear, but gently, as if testing the scent on the air. Her eyes narrowed. Not in aggression. In recognition. Curiosity, maybe. Something older than fear. The Lynx Cub hadn't moved. It barely seemed conscious. Its back paw was blistered, skin cracked open where flame had touched it. Fur had melted into skin. The side of its body rose and fell with shallow, labored breath. It was, by every law of the wild, a dying predator. And Ember was, by every expectation, a prey animal with no reason to care. But she did. She stepped forward. One hoof at a time, deliberate. She lowered her head slowly, neck stretching out like she was reaching for something fragile across a ravine. Then, gently, impossibly gently, she touched the cub's side with her muzzle. It twitched, weakly. Let out a rasping mewl that barely made it past its scorched lips. She recoiled slightly, then came back. Nudged again. The way a mare nudges her newborn to breathe. Riley was frozen behind his camera. He hadn't blinked in nearly 2 minutes. He knew this wasn't something to interfere with. This was something sacred, something the lens was lucky to witness, not shape. The sun rose higher. Smoke thinned to a dull haze. And Ember stayed. She didn't lie down. But she lowered her head and planted her stance, forelegs braced, hindquarters relaxed. A natural shelter. A silent vow. The wind had picked up by then, sweeping cold mountain air through the burned trees. Loose ash began to stir like gray snowfall. The cub whimpered again and tried to curl into itself, but its wounded leg refused to move. So Ember shifted. With one slow, careful motion, she turned her flank toward the breeze, placing her body directly between the cub and the wind. A wall of warmth in a valley of cold. She stood that way for hours. Riley moved only once, to adjust his position, staying downwind, out of sight. His camera rolled in near silence, capturing frame after frame, the rise and fall of Ember's breath, the occasional flick of her tail to chase invisible flies, the way she'd glance back at the cub every few minutes, just to check it hadn't stopped moving. There was no logic to it. No reward. No instinct that explained it. He whispered aloud, mostly to himself. "You should have run. Why didn't you run?" But the answer was already in front of him. She didn't run because something deeper had taken over. Not instinct. Not empathy, as humans define it. Something older. Something harder to name. As the sun dipped past its highest point, the shadows began to stretch long and broken across the ash field. Ember hadn't moved. Riley had documented hundreds of horses in the wild. None ever stood still this long unless they were guarding something. But what Ember was guarding shouldn't have mattered. And still, every time a branch cracked in the distance, she lifted her head, ears sharp. Every time a crow circled overhead, she stamped a hoof, as if the cub were her own. And then, just before dusk, something changed. The cub stirred. Really stirred. It tried to lift its head. Failed once. Tried again. Its tiny tongue flicked across its lips. Its eyes opened fully, glazed, but alert. Ember saw it. Riley saw her see it. And in a single flick of her ears, he swore, she softened. She stepped forward again. Touched the cub's ear with her nose. A brief nudge. And the cub didn't flinch. It leaned into her. Just barely. Just enough. But enough to change everything Riley thought he knew about the world. The sun had climbed past its apex and begun its long descent. But Ember had not moved. Not really. She shifted weight now and then. Took a few slow steps in circles. Snorted at a swirl of ash that kicked up in the breeze. But every time, she returned to the same spot. The same silent vigil beside the Lynx Cub. Riley had no words for what he was seeing. He'd been camped out under a scorched spruce stump, camera braced on a tripod, the lens trained tightly on the two figures. One, a half-starved, half-burned predator, barely old enough to survive without its mother. The other, a full-grown prey animal, wild, untamed, and yet somehow choosing to stay. Not once had Ember bolted. She could have. Easily. She should have. At least a dozen times, Riley counted her rising with alertness. A crack in the trees. The far-off call of a hawk. A gust of wind that carried the scent of something not quite gone. Each time, her body tensed. Her ears snapped forward. Her legs coiled, ready to flee. And yet, she didn't. She's not supposed to be like this, Riley whispered to himself, scribbling a note into his weather-stained field journal. A prey animal. Showing loyalty. Defending a carnivore. Staying when her instincts scream run. He paused. Looked through the viewfinder again. Then added. A species once hunted, protecting the hunter of its kind. Ember stood beside the cub as the air turned colder. She had taken to standing slightly forward, just ahead of it, her body angled like a living barricade. The lynx hadn't moved much, it had curled inward, the way wounded things do when pain becomes more real than presence. But it was breathing. And it was alive. Mid-afternoon brought a change in the wind. The smoke from the southern ridge thickened briefly, drifting in low, dry bands across the ash-choked earth. Ember blinked against it. Her nostrils flared. The cub began to cough. A soft, wet, guttural sound, barely audible at first, then sharper. Short bursts of panic from a tiny body already spent. Ember lowered her head quickly. At first Riley thought she was just inspecting. But then he saw it. She opened her mouth and licked the side of the cub's face. Once. Then again. And then down its scorched leg, slow, careful, deliberate strokes of her tongue, the way a mare would clean a newborn foal just minutes after birth. Riley exhaled too loudly and had to clamp his hand over his mouth. His body trembled. His lens trembled. He'd never seen this before. No one had. This wasn't sympathy. This wasn't reflex. This was a decision. After a while, Ember stepped back. She walked a short circle around the clearing, not far, just enough to sniff the edges of a nearby log, test the air. Then she paused at the edge of a burned-out pine trunk. Her ears rotated. Her head dipped. And she pawed the ground. Twice. Then again. Riley adjusted the focus. There, in the hollow of a fallen branch where the fire hadn't reached, lay a depression in the bark, blackened but intact. It had collected water. Maybe from an earlier rain. Maybe condensation from the ash fog that clung to everything after the burn. But there it was, a shallow pool of life in a valley of death. Ember sniffed. Lapped at it once. Then, unbelievably, she turned back toward the cub. Walked the full distance back. Stood over it again. Lowered her head. And nuzzled. The cub resisted at first, too weak. But Ember nudged again. Firmer this time. It rolled, barely, onto its good side. Raised its head, neck trembling with effort. And slowly, so slowly, it stood. Wobbled. Tried to walk, then collapsed. Ember stepped beside it. Waited. The cub tried again. Riley's jaw clenched. Then, step by shaking step, the cub followed her. Not because it knew why. Not because it trusted her. But because it was led. They made it halfway to the hollow. Ember stopped. Let the cub catch up. Then nudged the rim of the bark. The cub leaned in. Licked. It wasn't much. Maybe 4 or 5 laps. But Riley could see the change. It raised its head slightly higher after. Blinked more clearly. The tremble hadn't gone, but it had slowed. Ember stood by. Not impatient. Not proud. Just present. The light had shifted again by now, taking on that orange glow the mountains get before sundown. Shadows lengthened. The air chilled. Riley felt the cold creep into his jacket, but didn't move. He couldn't. Not during this. Because what he was watching wasn't survival. It wasn't nature doing what nature does. It was nature doing what it never should have. A herbivore. Not ignoring a predator. Not running from it. Not attacking it. But sacrificing comfort, time, and safety to keep it alive. And maybe that's what unsettled Riley most. Not what Ember did. But what she didn't do. She didn't flinch. She didn't flee. And above all, she didn't turn away. The cold settled in just after sunset. It wasn't the kind of cold that screamed winter, it was the kind that came in silence. Thin. Needle sharp. The kind that seeps through burned bark and hollow air and wraps itself around anything still warm. The kind that doesn't kill quickly, but slowly, by erosion. Riley zipped his tent closed with practiced hands. He had pitched it on higher ground, a full 100 yards away, just beyond the bend of the Ashen Ridge. From that angle, he had a clear view of the clearing where Ember and the Lynx Cub remained, still, like statues in a burnt cathedral. He didn't dare get closer. The tripod was locked in place. The thermal lens was calibrated. The batteries were fully charged. Everything was ready. But he still couldn't shake the feeling that he was trespassing. Through the infrared scope, Ember's form glowed faint orange, a steady pulse of heat in a land gone black. Beside her, much dimmer, was the Lynx Cub. Still alive. Still breathing. Barely. Ember hadn't left its side since twilight. Riley had counted 12 hours. No grazing. No movement beyond the perimeter. Just stillness. Devotion. The kind he'd only ever seen between bonded horses, mother to foal. Even then, not like this. Now, as the night deepened, she did something new. She lay down. folded her legs, lowered her massive body carefully beside the cub, not too close, not on top, but near enough that her breath fogged across the cub's singed fur with every exhale. And in that smoke-colored silence, with the camera rolling in grainy hues of red and gray, Riley watched her do what no textbook had prepared him for. She slept beside a predator. And not just any predator, a young hunter, injured, vulnerable, yes, but whose very bloodline had once stalked creatures like her across these same ridges. And still, she stayed. Time passed differently that night. Riley documented everything. He recorded the respiration rate of the cub, the twitch of Ember's ears, the rise and fall of her chest, the temperature drops, the noise levels. He logged wind speed, ambient light, all of it. But the numbers didn't explain what he was seeing. Because numbers didn't account for loyalty, or stillness, or warmth given without reason. At 3:42 a.m., the cub stirred. It reached out one paw, trembling, and touched Ember's chest. She didn't wake. But she shifted, just slightly, and the cub pressed in. Nestled. It slept there. Until just after 5 a.m. The world began to pale in shades of slate gray and muted blue. Dawn wasn't beautiful here, not anymore. It crawled, dim and heavy, through the skeletal trees like a memory trying to return to a place that no longer welcomed it. Riley poured cold coffee into a metal cup, his eyes still locked on the viewfinder. He whispered, "Still here." Then, movement. But not from the Mustang. From beyond. A low sound. Almost inaudible at first. A crackle. A grunt. Then, a deep, rumbling snort. Riley's stomach tightened. He adjusted the thermal scope. Red mass. Large. Moving low to the ground. Too big for a wolf. Too heavy for a deer. Then the shape emerged. A grizzly. Gray-backed. Mud-smeared. One I filmed over with old injury. It limped slightly, but its head swung in wide arcs, sniffing, sweeping, searching. It had been drawn by something. Maybe the smoke. Maybe the scent of rot in the soil. Or maybe the fragile breath of life still pulsing where death had claimed everything else. It stalked toward the clearing. Riley's fingers hovered over the camera's shutter, then dropped. There was nothing to film now that would explain what came next. He wanted to scream. To yell. To throw a rock. But he didn't move. Because Ember did. The moment the bear's scent hit her, she rose. Not fast. Not frantic. Controlled. Calm. She stood tall, flanks lean, ribs visible beneath her sooty coat, but eyes sharp. She didn't run. The cub whimpered softly beneath her. Ember glanced down, just once. Then stepped in front of it. Placed herself, fully, deliberately, between the grizzly and the lynx. She pawed the ground once. Stood her ground. And stared. The bear slowed. Its massive head lifted. Its breath steamed from nostrils black with soot. 20 feet. 15. 10. Riley's heart hammered in his chest. His breath came in bursts. Ember didn't move. The cub lay curled behind her, tiny and wide-eyed, but silent. The bear took one more step. Lowered its head. Eyes locked onto the Mustang. And then, a snarl. From the ridge, 3 figures appeared at once. Lynxes. Adult. Fast. Furious. One bounded down the incline with claws out. Another circled wide. The third landed near Ember's left flank and bared its teeth. They moved with precision, not chaos. This was a unit. A pack. A family. Riley choked out the words. That's her blood. It had to be. The posture, the protective orbit, the attention on the cub. These weren't random wild cats. They were the cub's parents, and maybe an older sibling. And yet, what they did next defied every rule of wild instinct. They didn't attack the Mustang. They didn't drive her away. They joined her. 3 lynxes took positions around the cub, forming a semicircle, with Ember still standing at the front. And together, they faced the bear. The standoff lasted only minutes. But to Riley, it felt like the edge of time. A horse. 3 predators. United, not by blood, not by biology, but by something deeper. By a shared understanding that life had chosen not to die, and they would not let it be taken now. The bear paused. Snorted. Then, slowly turned. And walked away. When the danger passed, Ember turned her head, just slightly, toward the lynxes. They didn't lunge. They didn't growl. One of them, the largest, stepped closer, brushed her shoulder. Acknowledgement. And just like that, prey and predator were no longer enemies. They were guardians of the same small life. The bear didn't retreat far. Just beyond the smoke-laced slope, it stood still, hulking, silent, watching. Even as the lynxes hissed and Ember pawed the dirt again, the grizzly lingered at the edge of the blackened world, caught in its own indecision. Predators aren't used to standoffs. They expect panic. They feed on it. But what the bear had met wasn't panic. It was presence. It was defiance. It was a line drawn not with teeth or claw, but with something older, more primal, protection without fear. Riley's pulse hadn't slowed. His knuckles were white from gripping the side of the camera for too long. He didn't dare move, afraid even the click of a shutter might break this impossible tension and turn instinct back into violence. And yet, in that unbearable stillness, something even stranger began to unfold. The largest of the lynxes, broader across the shoulders, with a half-torn ear and a thick mane like frostbitten moss, lowered its stance and approached the cub. Its nose dipped. Its mouth parted in short chirps, not growls. Not commands. Calls. The cub responded. Weakly at first, then with more effort. It let out a pitiful mewl and tried to rise. But it didn't stand on its own. Not yet. It turned, instinctively, toward Ember. And Ember, still facing the grizzly, glanced back. That one look was all it took. She stepped aside. Not in fear. Not in retreat. But in choice. She gave the cub back. It hobbled forward and collapsed into the thick fur beneath the largest lynx's chest. The other 2 lynxes crowded around, brushing against it, nuzzling, sniffing, vocalizing in low, frantic pulses of recognition and relief. A family reunited. Riley caught it all, every frame, every tremble, every twitch of muscle and tail and ear. But none of it made sense. Because this next part should have followed the script of nature. Now that the cub was safe. Now that the horse had moved aside. Now that the hierarchy had rebalanced. The lynxes should have turned on Ember. Should have warned her off. Driven her out. Reclaimed their territory. Marked their cub with scent and claw and made it clear, predator stays, prey leaves. But none of that happened. Instead, something else. Something he would remember for the rest of his life. The lynxes didn't leave her. They joined her. It began with proximity. One lynx, the smaller, younger one, circled wide and took up a position not beside the cub, but beside Ember. Another followed, pausing only to look back at the grizzly still watching from the far ridge. Then the largest one, the alpha, if wild lynxes could be called such a thing, approached Ember directly. Riley braced. They met nose to nose. Close enough to strike. To bite. To end it. But no violence came. The lynx held its ground. Looked at her. Stepped around her side, brushing its body along hers in a slow arc, the way big cats scent mark familiar kin. Then it stopped. Sat down. And turned, not toward the cub, not toward its pack, but toward the bear. 5 beings now stood in formation. 1 horse. 3 predators. And the cub, barely visible, nestled behind them all. It wasn't a fight. It was a front. And the bear knew it. It took 1 heavy step forward. Riley felt the earth move. Ember didn't twitch. The lynxes didn't flinch. Another step. A low growl. Still, no one moved. Their silence was not submission. It was a line in the ash. The bear stopped. It swayed. Considered. And then, finally, it turned. Slow. Heavy. Almost reluctant. It lumbered back toward the burned tree-line, vanishing behind a veil of low fog and the brittle groan of scorched branches. For the first time in what felt like hours, Riley exhaled. He didn't say anything. He couldn't. His throat was tight. His eyes stung, not from smoke. He looked through the camera one more time and whispered. They're not predator and prey anymore. They're survivors. And they know it. The standoff broken, Ember relaxed her shoulders. Not fully, but enough. She turned her head and looked at the lynx cub one more time. And the cub looked back. Its eyes weren't filled with fear. Or confusion. Or even dependence. They were calm. A recognition passed between them that Riley had no language for. Not gratitude. Not bonding. Acknowledgement. And as the lynxes tended to the cub, licking its fur, adjusting its position, murmuring in that wild, secret tongue only they knew, Ember remained. She didn't walk away. She didn't turn her back. She stood a few feet off, just at the edge of the gathering, and watched. Riley turned off the camera. For the first time in his career, he knew what he'd just captured couldn't be explained in footage alone. This wasn't a story about a horse and a lynx. Or about survival. Or even about instinct. This was about something that rewrote the very definitions of those things. In his journal, later, he'd write, "We often think of survival as teeth, claw, and running faster than death. But sometimes, survival is standing still beside something you don't understand and refusing to walk away." And beneath that, scrawled in rushed ink, almost illegible. They knew. Somehow, they all knew, the fire didn't take everything. It left behind a choice. Riley Morgan didn't leave the ridge for 3 more days. He couldn't. Even after the lynxes disappeared into the fog, even after Ember wandered off into the shadows of the charcoal forest, he stayed, half out of duty, half out of disbelief. His hands had filmed war zones. His lens had captured both mercy killings and dying prayers. But nothing, not one thing, had ever undone him like this. So he didn't pack his gear. Not right away. He just sat there. Alone. Writing. Rewinding footage. Watching it again. And again. And again. By the time he returned to civilization, he wasn't the same man who had hiked into the burn zone 11 days earlier. The story broke 1 week later. It started small, an exclusive piece in Wild Earth Journal, buried behind a headline about melting permafrost. But within 48 hours, the photos went viral. The still said more than any caption ever could. Ember curled around a dying lynx cub, her breath fogging the air. The lynx family forming a protective wall around a horse. A lone Mustang facing down a grizzly, eyes unblinking. People didn't scroll past those images. They stopped. They stared. And many cried. Riley had titled the set simply, Instinct Undone. It should have ended there, quietly, beautifully. A moment sealed in film. A story left in the trees. But the internet doesn't work that way. Within days, YouTubers, bloggers, wildlife influencers, and amateur conservationists descended on the burned valley like bees to smoke. They brought drones, long lenses, tour buses, guided hikes. They wanted to see the horse. They wanted their moment. But the wild is not a zoo. The first to notice was a ranger, an old friend of Riley's. "The Mustang's gone," he said bluntly. "Tracks vanished 3 ridges east. It's like she disappeared. And the lynxes? Gone too." The balance, delicate and accidental, had collapsed under the weight of curiosity. Riley didn't speak publicly about it. He refused interviews. He turned down television rights and a documentary deal. Instead, he returned to the ridge. Alone. But this time, he brought nothing but silence. He set up one motion-activated camera. Just one. Hidden deep in a hollowed log where no human scent would reach. It pointed toward the exact spot where Ember had once stood, just above the shallow curve in the land where the lynx cub had first been found. And then he left. No hashtags. No sponsors. No glory. Just space. 2 weeks passed. No footage. On the 15th morning, something changed. Riley opened his inbox and found the first still frame, automatically generated by the hidden camera. It was grainy. Dim, filtered by morning mist. But unmistakable. Ember. Standing alone. In the same clearing. Facing the same patch of burned ground. Where the lynx had once lain. She returned the next day. And the day after. Always at dawn. Always alone. She didn't graze. Didn't lie down. Didn't call. She just stood. 10 minutes. Sometimes 20. Then disappeared again into the blackened trees. As if waiting. As if remembering. As if still guarding something the fire had not fully taken. Riley never released those images. They were too sacred. Some truths, he decided, were not meant for headlines. He printed one of the photos, the clearest of the series, and framed it on the wall above his desk. In it, Ember's silhouette stood against a line of pale light breaking over the ridge. No lynx. No bear. No threat. Just her. Alone. Still watching. Still waiting. In his final journal entry on the subject, Riley wrote, "We tried to explain it as instinct. As anomaly. But what if it wasn't? What if, for a moment, 2 species remembered a time before fear? Before hierarchy? What if survival wasn't just about staying alive, but choosing what we're willing to protect, even if it's not our own?" He closed the notebook. Turned off the camera. And finally, let the forest keep the rest of the story. It was almost a year later when Riley Morgan stood behind the podium. The hall was filled with scientists, conservationists, journalists, students, and people who had never set foot in a forest, but had seen the photos. The screen behind him showed no image. Just the title. What We Forgot, and What the Fire Remembered. He didn't speak right away. He looked down at his notes, then closed the folder and spoke from memory. His voice was slow. Gravel-edged. Honest. I used to chase moments, he said. That was my job. Find something rare. Frame it. Capture it before it disappeared. I went into that forest thinking I'd document what was left of a dying landscape. Another story of loss. Another tally in the endless ledger of what we've broken. He paused. But I didn't come back with a photograph. I came back with something much harder to define. A shift. A wound, maybe. Or a kind of awakening. The lights dimmed. Behind him, a single image appeared. Not the Grizzly. Not the standoff. It was Ember. Alone. In the clearing. Looking not at the camera, but beyond it. We talk about instinct, Riley continued. About what animals are supposed to do. Prey runs. Predator hunts. That's the order we built everything on, tooth and blood and hierarchy. He turned slightly. Looked back at her. But that horse didn't run. She stood still. She risked her life for something that should have killed her one day. And in doing that, she reminded me of something terrifying, that nature isn't bound by our categories. It doesn't care what we've come to expect. Another photo appeared, Ember lying beside the cub. Maybe the fire didn't just burn the trees. Maybe it burned down the walls we've put between species. Between survival and compassion. Between fear and love. He stepped away from the mic, let the silence linger. Then, softly. The fire took a lot from that forest. But in the ash, one being chose not to fear what might hurt her. She feared only one thing. That something small and alone might die cold. He ended the talk without applause. Only quiet. Because sometimes the deepest truths don't need noise. They need space. And in that silence, in that unspoken knowing, the story found its final breath. Now, it's your turn. If this story reached something in you, if it made you pause, don't let it vanish like smoke. Share it. Not because it's beautiful, but because it's true. Because it shows us that the wild still remembers what we've forgotten. That survival doesn't always mean conquest. Sometimes it means standing beside something that isn't you and choosing not to walk away. Let us know in the comments, what did you feel when Ember refused to run? What do you think we're meant to learn from her? Like this video if you believe empathy can cross species. Share it with someone who's forgotten that nature still holds mysteries worth protecting. Subscribe so you never miss the next story, because out there, in the wild, some of the most powerful truths still walk on four legs.